My father said something in the hospital that I will never forget. She's not my daughter. Everyone in the room went silent. I thought he was confused because of the medication. Then my mother started crying. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. I was standing beside his hospital bed, holding a paper cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the heart monitor blink steadily beside him. My dad looked exhausted. His face was pale, his voice was weak, and there was an IV taped to the back of his hand. So when he said it, my first thought wasn't, what does he mean? It was he's confused. He had been through a terrifying night. But then, my mother covered her mouth, and she started crying. Not the quiet kind of crying, where someone wipes away a tear and tries to stay composed. She folded forward in the chair beside the window and sobbed into both hands. That was when I stopped thinking my dad was confused, because my mother wasn't surprised. She was scared, and somehow, that was worse. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 27, and until that night, I had never seriously questioned whether Daniel and Susan Bennett were my parents. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. My dad owned a commercial plumbing company that he'd built from almost nothing. My mom worked part-time at a dental office for years before eventually staying home when my younger brother Noah was born. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling either. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons but still ordered pizza on Friday nights. The kind that argued over who forgot to take the trash out, and then watched football together anyway. At least, that's what I thought. My relationship with my dad had always been complicated in a way I couldn't explain. He wasn't cruel. He hugged me. He showed up to my high school graduation. He helped me change a tire when I was 22, and called me 3 times afterward to make sure I got home safely. But there had always been a distance between us. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me in a way I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not affection, recognition maybe, like he was trying to remember something. I used to joke about it. Why do you look at me like I'm a math problem? He'd usually laugh, because you're complicated. I'd roll my eyes. You're the one who raised me. He'd smile. Exactly. I never thought much about that conversation until the hospital. The night everything changed started with a phone call at 2:13 in the morning. My mom called me. I was half asleep when I answered. Claire? Her voice was shaking. Mom, what's wrong? It's your dad. I sat up immediately. What happened? He collapsed. I was already getting out of bed. Is he okay? They're taking him to Street, Vincent's. Is he awake? There was a pause. Not really. I threw on jeans and a sweatshirt. I remember driving to the hospital with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. I kept telling myself the same thing. He's going to be okay. People collapsed. People went to hospitals. People recovered. That was what I needed to believe. When I arrived, my mother was sitting in a plastic chair outside the emergency department. Her hair was messy. She was still wearing the sweater she'd had on at home. She stood when she saw me. Oh, honey. She hugged me so tightly that for a second I was 15 again. What happened? He was getting ready for bed, she whispered. He said he felt dizzy. Then he just... She stopped. Mom. He fell. I held her shoulders. Is he awake? They stabilized him. That's good. She nodded, but she didn't look relieved. That bothered me. What aren't you telling me? Nothing. Mom. She looked toward the hallway. Your dad needs you right now. That was all she'd say. A doctor eventually came out and told us Dad had experienced a serious cardiac episode. He was stable, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation and run more tests. I remember feeling my whole body loosen. Stable. That word sounded like salvation. A few hours later they let us into his room. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. My dad had always been a big man. Broad shoulders, thick hands, a loud voice. Now he was lying beneath a white hospital blanket with wires attached to his chest. I walked over and touched his arm. Hey, Dad. His eyes opened. For a moment, he looked directly at me. Then his expression changed. Not recognition. Fear. It was so brief that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Hey, I said softly. It's me. He stared at me. My mother stood behind me. Dad's lips moved. Claire? Yeah. I smiled. I'm here. He looked toward my mother, then back at me. And that's when he said it. She's not my daughter. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain couldn't process what I'd just heard. What? Dad looked at me again. She's not my daughter. The room went completely still. My mother began crying. I looked at her, then at him. Mom. She didn't answer. I turned back to my dad. Dad, it's me. He closed his eyes. Don't call me that. My stomach dropped. A nurse came into the room and noticed immediately that something was wrong. Mr. Bennett, I need you to relax. My dad turned his head away. My mother was crying harder now. I stepped into the hallway. Mom, what is happening? She followed me. Claire. Why did Dad say I'm not his daughter? I don't know. You obviously do. She shook her head. He's sick. Mom, he looked directly at me. He isn't thinking clearly. Then why are you crying? She didn't answer. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Because if this were only about medication, confusion, or fear, my mother would have told me that. Instead, she was standing in a hospital hallway, looking like someone had just opened a door she'd spent 27 years trying to keep closed. I went back into the room. Dad was asleep. I sat in the chair beside him. My mother stayed near the window. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I asked, Did you ever tell Dad something about me? She looked at me. What do you mean? Something that would make him say that. Her face tightened. No. Mom, I said no. It was the first time in my life she'd ever sounded afraid of me asking a question. I went home that morning with a headache and no answers. Dad stayed in the hospital for several days. Doctors said his heart was stable, but they wanted to monitor him. He never repeated what he'd said. Whenever I asked him about it, he looked away. Once, I finally said, Do you really believe I'm not your daughter? He stared at the wall. I was confused. About me? He didn't answer. That hurt more than I expected. My mother kept telling me to let it go. Your dad is sick. I know. He didn't mean it. Then why won't either of you explain it? She sighed. Because there is nothing to explain. But there was. I knew there was. And once you realize someone is hiding something from you, ordinary memories start looking different. I began thinking about things I'd never questioned before. When I was little, Dad never liked talking about my birth. If someone asked when I was born, Mom answered. If someone asked about the hospital, she answered. If someone asked Dad, he'd usually say, Ask your mother. I had assumed that was just their dynamic. Then, there were the photographs. We had dozens of family albums. But there was a strange gap. Pictures of my mother pregnant with Noah. Pictures of Noah as a newborn. Pictures of me at 3 months old. But almost nothing from the day I was born. I remembered asking about it once. I was maybe 12. Why don't we have pictures from when I was born? Mom had smiled and said the camera broke. At the time, I accepted it. Now I wasn't sure. A week after Dad came home, I found an old photograph while helping Mom clean the basement. It was tucked inside a box marked Christmas 2001. The picture showed my mother holding a baby. She was younger, much younger. And beside her stood my dad. Except, something was wrong. The baby wasn't me. At least, I didn't think it was. I stared at it. Mom? She came down the basement stairs. When she saw the photograph in my hand, she stopped. What is that? You tell me. She walked toward me, then stopped. Put it back. Why? Because it's old. Who's the baby? Her face went pale. Claire. Mom. She took the photograph from me. Some things don't need to be explained. That sentence stayed with me. Some things don't need to be explained. It wasn't an answer. It was a warning. A few days later, I searched through the basement again when she was at work. I wasn't proud of it. But I was done pretending I wasn't scared. I found old tax records, insurance papers, hospital bills, birth announcements, and then I found something that made my hands go cold. A hospital bracelet. It was inside an envelope. The name printed on it wasn't Claire Bennett. It said, Baby Girl, Bennett. No first name. No date that I recognized. Just a date. March 14th, 1999. My birthday. I stared at it for a long time. Then I noticed something else. Written in blue ink on the back of the envelope were 4 words. Transferred by mother's request. I didn't know what that meant. Transferred where? Why? And why had my mother never told me? I put everything back exactly where I'd found it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad's face in the hospital. She's not my daughter. Maybe he had been confused. Maybe he had been hallucinating. Maybe he was remembering something from 27 years ago. But if that was true, why did my mother cry? The next morning, I called the hospital. I almost hung up twice before someone answered. I asked whether old medical records could still exist. The woman on the phone told me records that old were difficult to access, but certain birth and neonatal records could sometimes be archived. I didn't give her the whole story. I just said I was trying to understand something about my birth. She gave me a number for medical records. I didn't expect anything to come from it. 3 days later, someone from the hospital called me. Ms. Bennett? Yes? We found an archived record connected to your date of birth. My heart started pounding. What does it say? There was a pause. Before I discuss that, I need to verify some information. I answered the questions. My full name, date of birth, parents' names. Then the woman on the phone said something that made my blood run cold. There appears to be an additional maternal contact listed on the original record. An additional contact? Yes. Who? Another pause. I think you need to come in. I went the next afternoon. The hospital smelled exactly the way hospitals always do. Antiseptic. Coffee. Something warm coming from the cafeteria. I met an older records coordinator named Karen, who led me into a small office. She placed a thin folder on the desk. I want you to understand that some of these records are very old. I nodded. She opened the folder. The first page was a newborn intake form. My name wasn't on it. It said, Baby Girl, Mother, Rebecca Hart. I stopped breathing. That's not my mother. Karen looked at me. Your mother's name is Susan Bennett? Yes. Karen frowned. That's not what this says. I stared at the page. Who is Rebecca Hart? I don't know. Karen turned another page. There was an old handwritten note. The handwriting was messy and faded. Karen read it silently. Then she looked at me. Do you recognize this name? I shook my head. What does it say? She hesitated. Rebecca requested that the baby's records be restricted from the father. My entire body went cold. The father? Karen nodded. There's a name here. I leaned forward. She pointed to the page. Daniel Bennett. My father's name. I looked at her. That's impossible. Karen didn't respond. I turned the page myself. There was a photograph. A woman sitting in a hospital bed. She was holding a tiny baby. I had never seen her before. But there was something about her face. Something familiar, not enough to identify. Just enough to make my stomach twist. Under the photograph was a handwritten note. Mother requested protection for infant from Daniel Bennett, pending legal review. I looked up. Why would my mother need protection from my father? Karen didn't answer. I don't understand. I don't either, she said carefully. I'm only showing you what the archived record says. I stared at the photograph again. The woman holding the baby looked exhausted. But she was smiling, like she knew she was doing something important. Is this Rebecca? Karen nodded. That's what the file says. Then who is she? Karen sat back. I thought you knew. I don't. She looked at me for several seconds. Then she reached into the folder and pulled out one final document. It was an old emergency contact form. The father's name was Daniel Bennett. The mother's name was Rebecca Hart. And beneath them, in handwriting that looked completely different from the rest, was a sentence. Do not release infant to father without maternal authorization. I felt dizzy. Why? Karen's voice softened. I don't know. Then why was I given to him? She looked at the record again. According to this file, you weren't. I stared at her. What? Karen slowly turned the final page toward me. There was a transfer record dated 2 days after my birth, a signature, a hospital employee's initials, and beneath it, a handwritten note that had been added years later. Records transferred at request of Susan Bennett. My mother's name. But the signature wasn't hers. I knew because I had seen her sign my school forms my entire life. This isn't my mom's handwriting. Karen nodded. I noticed that. Then whose is it? She looked at the bottom of the page. There was a name I'd never heard before. Then Karen said something that made everything inside me go still. Claire, I don't think your father was confused in that hospital room. I stared at her. She closed the folder. I think he remembered exactly what happened. And as I looked back at the photograph of the woman holding the baby, I finally understood why my mother had started crying the moment my father said I wasn't his daughter. She wasn't afraid that he was confused. She was afraid that he was finally telling the truth. I kept staring at Karen, waiting for her to take it back. She didn't. The hallway outside my dad's hospital room suddenly felt too bright. Nurses were moving carts past us, monitors were beeping behind closed doors, and somewhere down the hall, a printer was spitting out paperwork like it was any other ordinary night. But nothing about my life felt ordinary anymore. What truth? I asked. Karen looked toward my dad's room before answering. The truth about who your biological father is. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misheard her. My biological father? Karen nodded slowly. I know this is a lot, Claire, and I don't know everything. I need you to understand that. I only know what I saw in those records years ago, and what your mother told me when you were a baby. I felt my stomach tighten. My mother told you something? She did. Then why didn't she tell me? Karen's eyes filled with something that looked almost like pity. Because she was scared. That word again. Scared. Everyone seemed to know my mother had been scared except me. I looked through the small window in my father's hospital door. He was lying in the bed with his eyes closed, an oxygen tube beneath his nose. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. That was the man who had raised me. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who waited outside my high school on the night I got my driver's permit. The man who used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, even though he always burned the first batch. And that man had looked at me in that hospital room and said, "She's not my daughter." I had spent hours trying to convince myself that medication had made him confused. Now I wasn't sure I wanted that explanation anymore. What was her name? I asked. Karen hesitated. The woman in the photograph? I nodded. Her name was Rebecca Miller. The name hit me strangely, not because I recognized it, because the first didn't. Who was Rebecca? Karen glanced at the photograph in my hand. She was the person listed as your biological father's emergency contact on your original hospital paperwork. I stared at her. That doesn't make sense. I know. My dad was listed as my father. On the later records. I felt cold. What do you mean later? Karen pulled a chair away from the wall and sat down. You need to sit. I've been sitting all night. Claire, there was something in her voice that made me obey. She sat across from me. Your mother came into this hospital 16 years ago. She was 24. She was alone. She had just given birth to you. I swallowed. She told the staff your father was Daniel? Karen shook her head. No. That single word changed everything. Then who? Karen looked down at the photograph. She told us your father's name was Thomas Miller. I stared at her. Thomas Miller? Yes. Then who's Rebecca? His sister. I couldn't speak. Karen continued carefully. Your mother told us Thomas was your biological father, but she also told us she was afraid of him. I remembered my father's face in the hospital. Not confusion. Fear. Why? Karen folded her hands. She said Thomas had been trying to get custody of you before you were even born. She was terrified that if he found out where you were, he'd take you. I shook my head. This is impossible. My father is Daniel. Karen nodded. Daniel became your legal father shortly after you were born. Why? Because your mother asked him to. I stood up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. Daniel knew? Karen didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. My dad knew? Yes. I walked to the window at the end of the hall. For 16 years, I had believed my childhood was simple. My parents had met. They had fallen in love. My mother had gotten pregnant. My father had been there. My mother died when I was young. My father raised me. That was the story. Except apparently it wasn't. Why would my mother lie? Karen looked at me. She didn't lie to you. She protected you. I turned around. From what? From a man who didn't want you to have a choice. Karen reached into the folder and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and yellow around the edges. This was kept with your original records. I opened it. The handwriting was small and shaky. I recognized it immediately. My mother. I had seen her handwriting on birthday cards and the few recipes she'd left behind. My hands started trembling. The note was addressed to Daniel. It said, "Daniel, if you are reading this, please keep her safe. Thomas cannot know where she is. I know this isn't fair to you, but I don't know who else I can trust. If Claire ever asks about her father, tell her only what you believe she can handle. I would rather have her hate me someday than let him find her." I read it twice, then a third time. My eyes burned. "Thomas was my father," I whispered. Karen nodded. "According to the original record, yes." I looked at the photograph again. A young woman stood beside a man I had never seen. The woman was Rebecca. The man was Thomas. And in the corner of the photograph was my mother. Pregnant. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. But one question kept pounding through my head. If Daniel wasn't my biological father, why did he raise me? Karen's expression softened. "Because he loved your mother." I closed my eyes. There were pieces of my childhood that suddenly looked different. My father never talked about my mother. Not really. Whenever I asked what she was like, he'd say, "She was complicated." Whenever I asked about my grandparents, he'd change the subject. Whenever I asked why I didn't look much like him, he'd laugh and say, "You got lucky." I'd always thought those were normal family things. Now they felt like pieces of a story someone had carefully cut out. "Where is Thomas now?" I asked. Karen looked down. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "The last update in the record is from when you were a few months old. Your mother changed her address. Daniel became your legal guardian. After that, there was nothing." I felt a strange relief. Then Karen added, "But that's not the only thing you need to know." I looked at her. "What?" She pulled out another document. This was added years later. It was a photocopy of a court filing. My name was on it. So was Daniel's. And beneath them was another name. Thomas Miller. My hands went numb. "What's this?" "A petition." "For what?" "Paternity." I looked up. Karen spoke quietly. "Thomas challenged Daniel's legal parentage." I couldn't breathe. "When?" "When you were 3. I stared at the page. "Did he win?" "No." "Why?" "Because he never appeared for the final hearing." "Where did he go?" "We don't know." I read the document again. There was a line highlighted in yellow. "Petitioner has failed to appear and has not maintained contact." My mother had been right. He had disappeared. But there was another question. If this happened when I was 3, why didn't my dad ever tell me? Karen didn't answer, because the answer was probably the same one I'd been avoiding all night. Fear. My dad hadn't been protecting me from the truth. He had been protecting himself from what the truth might mean. I left the hallway and went back into my father's room. My mother wasn't there. She had gone home earlier, or at least that's what I thought. My father was awake. His eyes opened when I walked in. He looked at me, then he looked at the photograph in my hand. His face changed. Not confusion, recognition. "You found it," he whispered. I stopped beside the bed. "You knew." He closed his eyes. "Claire, you knew." His lips trembled. "Yes." That one word hurt more than anything else that night. I pulled the chair closer. Was my mother telling the truth? He stared at the ceiling. "About Thomas?" He nodded. "Yes." I felt tears running down my face. "Then why did you say I'm not your daughter?" He turned his head toward me. "Because I was scared. Of what? That I'd die before I could tell you. The room went quiet. He reached for my hand. I didn't give it to him. Tell me everything. He swallowed. Your mother and I weren't married when she got pregnant. She was already involved with Thomas. Their relationship was bad. He was controlling, angry. He wanted the baby, but your mother was terrified of what he'd do. Then you stepped in. I loved her. And you loved me? He looked at me. I loved you before I ever held you. That broke something inside me. I sat down. My father continued. Your mother asked me to help her disappear. She wanted to leave town. She wanted you away from Thomas. So why didn't she take me and leave? She tried. He looked toward the window. She was going to take you to Oregon. She had everything packed. What happened? Thomas found out. My father stopped. He came to the house. My chest tightened. He didn't hurt her, Dad said quickly, but he threatened her. He told her he'd take you and make sure she'd never see you again. My father looked at me. That was the last time your mother ever spoke to him. What happened after? She came here. To this hospital? Yes. She gave birth here? Yes. And she left me with you? She asked me to become your father. I stared at him. Why didn't she just tell me? She planned to. When? She wrote you letters. My heart stopped. What? He nodded. Your mother wrote you letters for years. Where are they? He looked away. Dad, I have them. Where? In the attic. I stood up. You kept letters from my mother from me? I thought I was protecting you. You keep saying that. His eyes filled with tears. I made mistakes. I looked at him. You didn't make one mistake. He nodded slowly. I know. Before I could say anything else, the hospital door opened. My mother walked in. She stopped when she saw the photograph. Then she closed her eyes. Mom. She looked at me. I know. She started crying. You know about Thomas. Yes. You knew everything? She shook her head. Not everything. Then tell me what you knew. She sat down beside my father. When your father first told me about Thomas, I thought he was exaggerating. I thought your mother had left him because she wanted a different life. She looked at the photograph. Then I found the court papers. My voice cracked. You found them? Yes. When? Years ago. And you never told me. I was afraid. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Everybody was afraid. My mother cried harder. I was afraid you'd hate us. I hate that everyone decided I couldn't handle my own life. My father looked at me. You're right. That was the first time I'd ever heard him say it. No excuse, no explanation, just the truth. I left the hospital before sunrise. I didn't go home. I went to my father's house, climbed into the attic, and found the box. It was tucked behind an old Christmas tree. My mother's handwriting was on the top. For Claire, there were 17 envelopes, one for almost every year of my life. I sat on the attic floor and opened the first one. Dear Claire, if you're reading this, then you're old enough to understand that sometimes adults make choices because they're afraid. I hope someday you'll understand that none of those choices were because you weren't loved. I couldn't keep reading. I cried until my chest hurt. Then I opened the next letter. And the next. She wrote about my first steps. My first day of school. The time I broke my arm falling off a swing. The year I got my first A in math. She knew everything. My father had never told me. But my mother had somehow been there through every year. Near the bottom of the box was one final envelope. It was different. No date. Only my name. I opened it. Claire, if Daniel ever tells you the truth, please don't hate him for being afraid. He saved you when I couldn't. I stopped. There was another page. Thomas was not the only thing I was afraid of. I was afraid that if you ever found out Daniel wasn't your biological father, you'd believe that meant you weren't really his daughter. My eyes filled again. Please don't make that mistake. I looked toward the attic door. My father was standing there. He had followed me upstairs. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "You were my dad even when you knew you weren't my biological father." He nodded. I never needed blood. His face crumpled. I know. I needed honesty. He wiped his eyes. I know that too. We sat on the floor together. For the first time in 16 years, there was nothing between us except the truth. A few weeks later, my father finally told me the rest. Thomas had never contacted us again. Rebecca had kept copies of the original hospital records because she was afraid the story would be changed. My mother eventually died without ever finding the courage to tell me everything. And my father had spent 16 years carrying a secret he believed was protecting me. He had been wrong. But he had also loved me. Both things could be true. That was the hardest part. There wasn't a perfect villain in my story. There were just frightened people who made decisions for me because they thought they knew what was best. And there was me, 16 years old, trying to understand why the people who loved me had been so afraid of the truth. A month after the hospital incident, my father asked if I wanted to take a DNA test. I said yes. Not because I needed proof that Thomas was my biological father. I already knew. I needed proof of something else. I needed to know that biology didn't get to rewrite 16 years of love. The results confirmed what the old records said. Thomas Miller was my biological father. Daniel Hart was not. But when the results came in, I looked at the man sitting beside me and realized something. The test hadn't changed who my father was. It had only changed one word on a piece of paper. Daniel still knew how I liked my coffee. He still remembered my first bike. He still had the terrible Christmas sweater I'd made him in elementary school. He was still the person who stayed awake when I had nightmares. He was still Dad. We didn't fix everything overnight. I was angry for a long time. There were days I couldn't talk to him. There were days I didn't want to see my mother, because every letter reminded me that she had known more than I did. But eventually, I stopped asking myself whether my family had lied because they didn't love me. They had lied because they were scared. That didn't make it right. It just made it human. I still have my mother's letters. I keep them in a small wooden box now. And the photograph of her, Rebecca, and Thomas is in there too. For years, I thought the most painful sentence I'd ever hear was my father saying, "She's not my daughter." Now I understand what he was really saying. He wasn't telling me that I wasn't his. He was admitting that the story he'd been afraid to tell had finally caught up with him. I used to think being someone's daughter was something biology decided. Now I know better. Sometimes, family is the person whose blood runs through your veins. Sometimes it's the person who stays when the truth gets complicated. And sometimes, it's both. My father wasn't my biological father. But he was the man who chose me. And after 16 years of secrets, that choice was finally mine to understand for myself.